Dust veils shimmered in the late sun, a faded on the frontier, where the land cracked from thirst and wind carried more dust than hope. The town slouched between ochre canyons, its wooden bones creaking beneath the weight of silence. Storefronts peeled like old bark, and the saloon's swinging doors hung crooked, letting out the sour breath of old liquor and broken deals. Nothing here moved fast, except the vultures. Harlan Boone rode in slow, a thin man with a bent back and a mule more bones than beast. The sun had baked the color out of his shirt, the seams of his coat torn where the wind had tugged too long. His hat sagged low over his brow, shadowing the kind of eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. At his side, 2 silver coins clinked together in a leather pouch, his last hope tied up in metal the weight of a sin. The townsfolk barely noticed him. A few glanced up, then back down, trained by years of trouble to never look a stranger too long in the eye. Harlan tied his mule to a hitching post near the cattle yard and stood for a moment, squinting at the corral's edge. Flies buzzed over thin-ribbed cattle, most too weak to swat them away. He approached the gate. Jed, the merchant, sat on a barrel chewing something he hadn't paid for. His gut poured over his belt like rising dough. He saw Harlan and gave a sour grin, the kind meant more to mock than welcome. "Come to buy a dream, Boone," Jed said, spitting brown juice into the dust. Harlan didn't answer. He reached into his coat and showed the coins. Jed leaned forward, squinting. "That barely buys a tail and hooves. Prices have changed. They ain't worth more than buzzard feed." Harlan replied flatly. "You want feed, there's trough slop out back." Jed chuckled, and a few men nearby, leaning like weeds in the shade, snorted with laughter. Behind them stood a trio in black dusters, quiet and watching. The Blackthorn boys. Harlan looked over the cattle again, lips drawn tight. "I'll take that brown heifer, third from the post. Sick, but she'll walk." Jed shrugged. 3 coins. "I have 2. Jed stood, his voice louder now. "Then you don't have a cow." Harlan didn't argue. He turned, slow and stiff, like a man whose joints remembered gunfire. As he stepped away from the pen, ready to ride home empty, something tugged the hem of his coat. A voice came, barely more than breath. "Please help, it's my mother's last day." He looked down. A girl stood there, barefoot, dirt-smudged and small. Her hair was tangled like weeds caught in fence wire, and her dress hung on her like a scarecrow's sack. But her eyes, wide brown, and heavy with something older than her years, looked straight through him. For a long second, Harlan said nothing. Then he crouched slow. "Say again," he murmured. "She's sick," the girl whispered. "Hurt bad. We're hiding. I thought maybe you'd help." She clutched something to her chest. A rag doll, its head lopsided and worn. Harlan studied her a moment longer, noting the thinness of her arms, the tear in her dress, the bruise under her jaw, faded now but real. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara. You from here?" "We were." Her voice wavered. "But they took our land. Mama tried to fight. They hit her." His eyes moved past her, toward the stockyard's far fence. Beyond it, scrub brush leaned against a collapsing shed. "Where is she?" he asked. Clara pointed. "Behind there. She don't wake up sometimes." A sudden shout behind him turned his head. Jed was bellowing something crude, but Harlan didn't hear the words. His world had gone still. He looked at the coins in his hand. 2 pieces of silver. Enough to keep his mule alive another week. Enough, maybe, to buy time. But not for both of them. Clara was watching his hands. He looked down at her, the shadows of his past crawling up his spine, like old ghosts. He hadn't held a rifle in 10 years. Hadn't raised his voice, either. Just kept to the edge of the world, plowing dirt that gave back thorns. But this girl hadn't chosen to be here. And her voice, when she whispered, sounded too much like another voice he'd heard long ago, in the heat of a battlefield, when a nurse leaned down and said, "Stay with me." His jaw worked quietly. He took off his hat, ran a hand over his scalp, and let out a breath that sounded like surrender. "Show me," he said. Clara didn't smile. She just nodded and turned, bare feet slapping the hardpan as she led him past the yard, through the brittle fence, and into the weeds beyond. The shed leaned like a drunk in a windstorm. One side had caved in, and canvas flapped against a cracked window. Inside, the light dimmed to a dirty gold. A woman lay against the far wall, swaddled in a torn blanket. Her face was pale, hollow, lips dry and cracked. Blood had dried in one corner of her mouth. Her breathing was shallow. Eloise. The name came to him like thunder on a clear day. She'd once worn a medic's armband, had steadied his shaking hands after a firefight, had taken shrapnel from his shoulder and smiled while doing it. He stepped closer, barely breathing. "Eloise," he said softly. She didn't stir. Clara knelt beside her, brushing her mother's hair back. "She gets cold sometimes. And she talks in her sleep. About the river. About you, I think." "Me," she said. "Someone with eyes like yours saved her once." Harlan knelt, took her wrist gently. Weak pulse. Fevered skin. He touched her brow. She groaned faintly, flinched. "She needs water," he said. "We ran out 2 days ago." I gave her the last sip. Something tightened in his chest, sharp and merciless. He stood and went back outside. His saddlebag held a water skin, mostly full. He returned and lifted it to her lips. Some spilled, but she swallowed. Her eyes fluttered. Clara squeezed her mother's hand. "It's okay, Mama." He came. Eloise blinked, tried to focus. Harlan." He nodded. Her hand trembled as it reached for his. "You came back." He looked away. "Didn't know you were still breathing." She coughed, pain in every movement. "Not for much longer." "You're not dying today," he said flatly. Clara looked up. "Will you help us?" He nodded once. She wrapped her arms around his waist, sudden and fierce. In the dim shed, with dust motes dancing like spirits in the air, Harlan Boone, once a ghost, stood very still, letting the weight of that small embrace settle into the hollow place inside him. Even as a chill crept through the wind and the canyon shadows grew long, something flickered in him again, something that felt like fire. The shed groaned in the wind, like it might collapse with a single breath. Clara pushed open the broken door and glanced back, eyes asking Harlan to follow. He did, ducking beneath the splintered frame, boots scraping the cracked earth as he stepped inside. It stank of sweat, mildew, and blood. In the far corner, half covered in a threadbare quilt, Eloise lay unmoving. Her face was ashen, lips cracked and rimmed with dried red. Bruises ringed her wrists, her cheeks swollen purple-blue. Harlan knelt without a word, his hands moving by instinct, lifting the blanket, checking her breathing, touching the side of her throat. The pulse was there, but thready. He uncorked his water skin and tipped it gently against her mouth. She flinched, coughed, but swallowed. Clara knelt beside her mother and wiped her chin with the hem of her dress. "She was better this morning," she said softly, "but she gets cold fast. And when she talks, she says your name." Harlan's shoulders stiffened. "Does she know I'm here? She said you used to sing when you were scared." He didn't answer. Instead, he scanned the room. A single rusted pan in the corner, a broken oil lamp, and strips of torn fabric that had once been a curtain. He stood and opened the door wider to let light in, then stepped back out, returning moments later with dry brush and a few thick branches. He set them in the hearth and lit a small fire. Smoke curled up the broken chimney like a prayer. "Who did this?" he asked finally, though he already knew. Clara pulled the rag doll closer to her chest. "After Papa died, they came for our land. Said it belonged to Mudo now. Mama went to the sheriff, but he wouldn't listen. Said it wasn't worth the trouble. So Mama stood in the way. They beat her until she couldn't move. I watched. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. Harlan watched her, quiet, his jaw flexing. We ran," Clara continued. "Took whatever we could. I tried to find food, but people stopped helping. Said Blackthorn watches everything. We've been hiding out here for weeks." Harlan turned back to Eloise. She stirred again, murmuring something. He leaned closer. "River gunpowder." "Harlan." He closed his eyes. Once, years ago, he'd bled out on a battlefield while gunfire rained from the ridgeline. She'd knelt beside him with a surgeon's calm, sewing his side shut with thread and prayer. He'd never forgotten the feel of her hand steadying his. He never imagined she'd be the one left bleeding. She saved me, he murmured. Clara looked up. You knew her in the war. I wouldn't have come home if not for her. She reached into a sack beneath her cot and pulled something wrapped in cloth. She kept this. Said it was the only picture she ever liked. Inside was a faded photograph, 2 figures in uniform. One was Eloise, younger but just as strong in the eyes. The other was Harlan, smiling in a way he hadn't in years. He stared at the image for a long time. Clara watched his face. You gonna help us? His fingers closed over the photo. I am now. That night, the wind died. The desert held its breath as stars opened over the canyon. Harlan stood by his mule, digging through the old satchel he hadn't opened in years. At the bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth stiff with age, lay a revolver. He unwrapped it slowly. Rust clung to the cylinder, but the weight was familiar. He checked the chamber. 3 bullets left. Enough, maybe. He built up the fire in the shed, laid fresh cloth over Eloise's wounds, and tied strips of shirt for new bandages. Clara sat beside him, watching. You gonna get the bad man? She asked. His eyes didn't lift. Not for revenge. Then why? He paused, tying a knot. Because someone should have helped you a long time ago. Clara nodded and pulled the blanket up around her mother's shoulders. By dawn, he was gone. Dust Vale hadn't changed. The same men leaned outside the saloon. The same dirt wind chased tumbleweeds down the main street. But something was different in the way Harlan walked, like a man who'd buried the part of himself that doubted. He pushed through the saloon doors. Inside, the Blackthorn boys lounged near the bar. Clay Meadows sat in the corner, boots on the table, glass in hand. He barely glanced up. Well, look what the mule dragged back. Harlan didn't flinch. You left a woman to die. Took her land. Beat her in front of her child. Meadow laughed. You here to sermon me, farmer? I'm here to stop you. One of the gang stepped forward, hand drifting toward his hip. Harlan didn't blink. You touch that pistol, you'll lose the hand, he said. The man smirked. What are you going to do with that relic? The gun barked once. The man screamed, clutching his hand as blood sprayed across the floor. The saloon froze. Harlan's arm was still extended. The revolver held steady. He looked at Meadow. Next one's yours. Meadow rose slowly, the grin gone from his face. You've got no badge, no backup, and no friends in this town. I've got enough. Gunfire cracked. Bottles exploded behind the bar. Men shouted. Harlan ducked, rolled behind a table as wood splintered around him. He fired twice more, hitting one in the leg. Another bullet tore through his side. He stumbled out the back, blood running into his waistband, boots dragging through the dirt. He limped toward the sheriff's office, each step slower than the last. By the time he pushed through the door, his shirt was soaked red. The sheriff looked up, startled. Harlan dropped the revolver and fished something from his coat, a folded letter, stained and worn. What's this? A record, Harlan said, voice raw. Eloise wrote it. Names, dates, Meadow, his men, what they did, when they did it. The sheriff stared at the page. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, reading the neat script. At the bottom, Eloise's name, her late husband's signature, and one final line. If this reaches you, then I am likely dead. She's alive, Harlan said. Barely. The sheriff looked up. You've got courage. But courage doesn't matter if no one speaks up. I'll testify, Harlan rasped. That won't be enough. Harlan turned toward the doorway, blood dripping onto the floorboards. His eyes, clouded with pain, still held fire. Then it's time this town chose who it belongs to. He stepped outside, staggering to the center of the street. Doors creaked open. Faces peeked through curtains. The Blackthorn boys stepped onto the boardwalk, weapons drawn, eyes scanning for another shot. Harlan stood alone, chest heaving, one hand pressing his wound. They beat a woman half to death and took everything she had, he shouted. And every one of you watched. No one moved. Meadow sneered. Ain't your place, Boone. Maybe not, he said, but you made it mine. A long silence followed. Then, one by one, townsfolk stepped out. A shopkeeper, a ranch hand, a widow with a rifle. Someone gasped. Another cursed under their breath. Then a voice from the edge. I saw them drag her out. I did nothing. I won't do nothing again. The wind picked up, brushing dust over Harlan's boots. He didn't waver. Meadow turned, noticed the crowd growing, a whisper starting to pass through the street like wildfire. Behind him, the sheriff stepped out, shotgun in hand. He looked at Harlan. You sure about this? Harlan didn't answer. He didn't need to. By morning, Dust Vale had changed. The story passed from porch to porch, across barrels and bread lines. A farmer nobody knew had drawn on Clay Meadow and walked out breathing. The wound in his side hadn't slowed him. What had bled out was fear, not just blood. People spoke of it in hushed tones, then louder, then with fire in their chests. After so long under the gang's boot, someone had finally said no. And he wasn't even from here. Clara wandered the dusty main road with a photo clutched tight to her chest, the edges creased from too many hands. It showed a younger version of her mother, arms around a tall soldier with weary eyes. She held it up to shopkeepers, to widows on stoops, to old men playing cards outside the saloon. This man's helping us, she'd say, voice as steady as her feet were bare. Please, don't let them hurt him. At first, they looked away. Then they looked closer. Then, slowly, they nodded. That afternoon, the wind stirred uneasily as horses rode down from the canyon trail. The Blackthorn boys returned, 10 riders in black dusters, the glint of metal and malice in their hands. Clay Meadow led them, his jaw tight, his eyes promising nothing but blood. Word had reached him that something was shifting in town. He meant to stomp it flat. They rode hard down Main Street, the earth trembling beneath their hooves. But this time, the street wasn't empty. Men and women stood together in a ragged line. Shopkeepers with hammers, stable hands with pitchforks, a preacher holding a cross in one hand and a rifle in the other. No one spoke, but no one stepped aside either. At the far end, Harlan stood in the center of the road. He looked smaller than they remembered, paler, his shirt still wet from the blood that hadn't yet stopped leaking from his side. But he stood tall, spine straight, his revolver resting at his hip like it was part of his arm. Clay reined in. You got a death wish, Boone. You already tried, Harlan said. Didn't take. You think these people are going to protect you? I don't need protection. I need them to remember they ain't slaves. Clay spat. They've always been slaves. The sheriff stepped out from his office and took his place beside Harlan. His face was pale, but his rifle was steady. Not today, he said. For a heartbeat, time held its breath. Clay's hand twitched toward his gun. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harlan's hand tightened on the revolver. Clay's second-in-command raised his rifle. Then a voice rang out, hoarse but defiant, from behind the crowd. I wouldn't. The townsfolk parted as Eloise stepped forward. She walked slow, each step a victory against gravity and pain. Her dress hung loose on her thin frame, and bandages still wrapped her arms. But in her hands she carried her late husband's rifle, barrel polished and aimed true. Clara ran to her side, helping her walk. The crowd fell into silence. Clay blinked. You should be dead. Eloise stopped 10 paces from him and cocked the rifle. You first. Clay laughed, but it cracked. You ain't got the strength. She raised the barrel without shaking. I've had enough. And she fired. The shot ripped through Clay's thigh. He screamed, falling from his horse, clutching the wound as blood bloomed dark against his pants. The gang reared back in shock. One reached for his gun, only to see 50 more pointed back at him. The spell broke. The Blackthorn boys didn't ride, they fled. Mud flying from hooves, curses tossed over shoulders, guns never fired. The sheriff let them go. The town had already chosen. Eloise dropped the rifle. Clara caught her as she crumpled. Mama, she cried, voice breaking as she eased her to the ground. I'm okay, Eloise whispered, her head falling into her daughter's lap. Just tired. Real tired. Harlan moved slowly, clutching his side. He knelt beside them, eyes locked on hers. She smiled weakly, brushing Clara's cheek with trembling fingers. You came back, she whispered. You should have told me you were still alive. You should have ridden. she countered with a breathless smile. Clara looked between them, blinking back tears. Harlan reached down and laid his calloused hand over Eloise's. "You're not just some farmer," she said softly. "You're still the man who saved people. This time you saved us." He didn't answer, just sat beside her as the town circled, quiet and reverent. Someone placed a blanket over Eloise. Someone else helped Clara to her feet. Harlan looked around, at the people gathering rifles, at the man sweeping broken glass from the saloon's doorway, at the women hugging each other with relief. Then he stood. He turned toward his mule, tied at the post where he'd first arrived days ago, and began to walk. Behind him, Eloise called out, "Where are you going?" He paused. "Somewhere quiet," he said. "Somewhere I don't need to carry a gun." "Then don't go alone," she said. He looked back. Clara stood beside her mother, that old photograph still clutched in one hand. Her face was dirty, her eyes too wide for her age, but she smiled. And Harlan, for the first time in many years, smiled back. Some say Harlan Boone still wanders the canyon trails, looking for land not poisoned by greed. Others say he rides with Clara and her ma now, helping rebuild what the outlaws burned. There's a story whispered in Dust Vale every time the wind kicks up dust and the horizon burns red with sunset. It's the story of a quiet man who came with nothing but a coin and a promise and left behind a legend.